So hi Jay,
Hello.
it's lovely to meet you.
Terrific to meet you too.
You're a food critic, author, journalist.
Yeah, it gets a bit vague, doesn't it? What am I? When I'm asked what I do for a living, the first word that comes out of my mind is out of my mouth is journalist.
Yeah.
I have been a newspaper journalist since 1987. I was elected editor of the student newspaper in Leeds, which was a full-time job you got paid for. That was I took that up in September of 1987, and the one continuous thread is that I'm a reporter and a newspaper journalist, and so I've worked for many places. I was freelance at various times, had contracts with The Guardian, contracts with the Mail on Sunday, but I've been on the Observer newspaper now on contract since 96, so what's that, 27 years. So I think I'm now an Observer newspaper journalist.
Yeah,
It's a long time.
that's a long time. Yeah. When you started as a journalist, did you think your career would go in the ways it has?
No, absolutely not. So when I was a student editor, I had the full run of a tabloid newspaper. One of the reasons I chose Leeds University was because its student newspaper was very, very strong. It went round all the colleges in Leeds, and so we had a reach of about 25,000 people. And I reckoned that student journalism would be a really good thing for me. For another reason as well, my mother was very well known. She was very famous as a journalist, as an advice columnist. And I was very conscious that if I wasn't careful, I would be accused of getting into newspapers and journalism through my mother, through nepotism. And the idea I had in my head was that if I went to Leeds and got myself elected by a cross-campus vote of students who are an ornery lot, then nobody could accuse me of that. And that is what happened. I did get elected newspaper editor. Didn't help. I still got accused of nepotism, even though my dear old mum has been dead 12 years. But that was the plan. And so I became the editor, and I thought that I would be an editor, that I would go into newspapers and I would edit pages and so forth. But very quickly I discovered, no, I was going to be a writer. And very quickly too, I worked out that was a much better thing for me. I didn't really want to be sitting at desks, telling writers off, trying to commission copy, negotiating fees, rolling my eyes at other people's writing. No, I just wanted to do my own writing.
And what gave you that love for writing?
Writing, not everybody finds writing easy. It's one of the interesting things about all these AIs that have appeared in ChatGPT and all stuff. We can get into that. The joy of writing is you get to put the world into straight lines. The world is a complicated, confusing place. And as a writer, you have the opportunity to analyze it and explain it. And by doing so, you're explaining it to yourself. Plus, there's something else, which is, have you ever been in a room in a conversation with someone and you wanted to come back with the great witty response, but you only work out what the witty response is 15 minutes after you left the room? Well, being a writer gives you the opportunity to come up with the witty response at the time. You can put it down on paper. I find it a very comforting thing I like the process. You know, I spent today writing a restaurant review. The day before I was writing something else. So, you know, I find that process of arranging the world in sentences very comforting. It's and very grounding. And so, although there are many parts to my working life now, I'm a musician, I do TV, I do radio, whatever, I write books. It always comes back to that. I'm a writer first, second and third before you get to any of the other stuff.
And you do have a way of words. And I don't know, I think you're absolutely right. You really have to have love for writing. It's like, for instance, or way of words. It's like with Nigella Lawson.
Yeah, the thing is, there are two things to say about this. The first is not very attractive. Being a writer is an extremely arrogant act. It is saying, what I've got to say to you is worth listening to. And that is an arrogant act. It's saying, I'm clever, I've got something to say. So it's kind of grand and show-offy, and it's like you're tap dancing in the middle of the stage. But the other point about it is, if you're going to write, You need to recognize, I teach sometimes, and this is one of the very first things I say, nobody has to read a single thing you write, not even your mother. It is your job as a writer to make them read your words. And so I'm very conscious whenever I'm writing, how will I make someone continue to read my column all the way to the very end? What can I do? It is my job to entertain you. Even if I'm informing you, even if, frankly, it's quite a dark subject, there is something that has got to compel you to read. And I'm very conscious of desperate never to bore people. And again, that's quite an arrogant act as well.
Yeah. So, you never started out as a food writer?
No. I had no intention of writing about food. I had no expectation of being a restaurant critic. I don't think it would surprise you to look at me to know that I like my food. But I was a reporter. So it was an interesting sort of process. When I started at the beginning, because I hadn't gone to a journalism college, I wasn't allowed to be a news reporter. I had to be a soft arts writer, a soft feature writer. But I was, I think it's fair to say, a pretty good reporter. And bit by bit, the stories I wrote got harder and harder, and went from, I'm writing about this TV show and that film and interviewing that person, to, okay, he's a safe pair of hands, we can send him on a news story. And I ended up writing about murders, about crime, politics. I did a lot of investigative stuff. There wasn't much I didn't do apart from sport. Never covered sport. And then one day in 1999, a very long time ago, I went out for lunch with the editor of the Observer magazine, and she said, oh, the restaurant critic's moving on, I'm going to be the TV critic. My hand sort of went up and said, well, that's not a job you can apply for, but I'd be really good at that. I did like restaurants. I read restaurant reviews. I paid for restaurants with my own money, shock horror. I reckoned I needed a specialism as well. I was very tired. I'd spent 15 years swapping subjects back and forth, and I was exhausted. And she went away, and she came back and said, good news, I'd like you to be the restaurant critic. The bad news, the overall editor of the Observer doesn't want you to do it. He wants to keep you as a reporter. And so she told me that I was going to swap with somebody, the chief political correspondent. The only problem was he didn't really want to be the restaurant critic. So he did one, I did 10. He did another one, I did another 10. He went off on sabbatical to write a book, and I had the job. And even as it was emerging, I thought, yeah, this is me. This will suit me very well.
Yeah. What gave you that confidence to say, I'm going to, be a food critic, just like that?
Restaurant critic rather than food critic, and I'm quite clear about that. My job is to step into a room with tables and chairs where people pay for an experience, and to tell you how much value your money will buy you, how much pleasure your money will buy you. I mean, it does, obviously now it flows over into criticizing or analyzing the food, and I can do that. I do know my food. But if it came down to a room of, can you write 1,100 compelling words about an experience in a room? Yeah, I can do that. That's a job of journalism. That's a job of reporting. And I felt like a skilled reporter who'd cut his teeth. I'd been in many, many places. I'd been a foreign correspondent. This had to be easier than that. And I'd grown up in restaurants. My mother loved them. She'd taken me and my siblings to restaurants from a very young age. I felt like I understood them. And given I'm still doing the damn job 24 years later, I'm going to suggest that I do.
Yeah. So would you say easily you enjoy this aspect more than what you used to do before?
I'm a bit suspicious of it, to be honest. The one thing that happened was that as I advanced as a restaurant critic, the subject of food and restaurants started to seep into every aspect of my working life.
Yeah.
And I also found that there was a way to continue to be a reporter. There's a notebook in my back pocket as we're talking. I could write news stories about it. I could write features about it. I would eventually write books about it, reported books. I was hired by the One Show on BBC One to be their food reporter. And then I started writing novels with the food element as well. And so, in a way, I was trying to make sure that I didn't lose contact with what I'm a bit of a romantic. I think there's something quite noble about going out with a notebook and interviewing people and talking to people about their life experiences. So I think I still do that. I occasionally miss, the harder end of what I used to do a bit, but I'm getting on. It's fine.
Yeah. So when were you approached by TV?
It happened gradually, television. I mean, I was gagging for it early on. I had a very quick start in my newspaper career. I don't have to give you the whole details of my career, but having been the editor of a student paper, there was a moment in the late 80s when national newspapers were looking for anybody who understood what students wanted so they could launch student supplements to try and get students, readers when they were still students and then thought they'd have them for life. And so I was pulled into national papers and I had my first column when I was like 21 or something. And TV companies were sniffing around people like me, young talent, yeah. And all my experiences were rather irritating and annoying.
Yeah.
And I gave up on them, is the truth. And I'd be approached by so many people and I'd do screen tests and get nowhere. And then I remember, I think it was about 2006 or 7 when I was asked if I'd come to a meeting at Channel 4 to discuss an episode of Dispatches on rising food prices. Actually, it was 2008. And I went along to the meeting, and as I came out, I turned to the producer and said, "Oh, hang on, we're doing this, aren't we?" She said, "Oh, yeah, we are." And I was doing an hour of television for Channel 4. And I thought, oh, well, that's happened. And bit by bit, it led from there. I'd already started doing radio first, and that's kind of a common thing. There was a thing on Radio 4 called Newsstand, in which you wrote an analysis of one particular section of the newspaper or magazine business. So this week golfing magazines, this next week gardening magazine, whatever. And I did that quite a lot, and I liked radio, and got drawn into various bits of radio, and that's how I merged into TV. Performance, I've been in drama at university, bit of a show off. And so it seemed kind of an inevitable thing.
Yeah.
It was organic. That said, although people probably recognise me most for MasterChef, and we can talk about that, there's a lot of TV I don't really enjoy. I love radio. I adore radio. I have a show on Radio 4 called The Kitchen Cabinet, a food panel show. Called it last night. It's been going for 11 years. I've done every single episode. We do 26 a year. Fabulous.
Yeah.
TV is a faff. I always live in hope that I do a lot of various things, but there's certain kinds of TV I don't much enjoy doing. MasterChef is great.
Yeah.
I love a game show, but I don't really want to do documentary anymore. I did a lot for the One Show, and it was a great privilege, and I shouldn't be so, rolling my eyes about it, but the process of factual TV is not suited to me.
Why is that?
Because it's hurry up and wait. It's frustrating. And also, the more expensive a medium is, the more people get involved. So in newspapers, I write an article, I send it to one person, and one person sends it back to me. And that's the relationship, basically. I mean, there may be other people, but on a weekly basis, it's me and one person. Radio, the production team is 4. TV, there'll be 473 of them, and they'll all want to, express an opinion. They'll all be paranoid about the commissioning editors and what they want at the channel and all of that stuff. And it's frustrating. And I'm not very patient.
Yeah.
Apparently patience is a virtue. Nah, I don't think so. I think it's a waste of time. And I'm also not very patient with poor research. And I didn't get to control the research on a lot of it, and some of it I didn't think was that great. So the whole process didn't suit me. But, things like MasterChef, which is hardly working, sometimes can't believe I get paid for that, turn up, sit in a room, people bring you food, say smart-ass things, go home.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can do that.
And is MasterChef, is it what we see? Is that the actual truth?
Yes. Oh, look, one of the things I learned early on about television is it will sniff out fakery very, very quickly. It really will. If you are not honest, the camera will tell. Now, in the same way as when you're writing, you have to catch people's attention. When I'm on MasterChef, my job is not just to have an opinion, but to say it in an interesting way. It's a performance. And I sometimes joke that my job is to say something more interesting than William Sitwell or Grace Dent, so that they have to cut more of me in than them. I kind of mean it. That's the performance. But the essence of what I'm saying, you can't just do it for effect. You can't just be rude about a dish because you think it'd be funny.
Yeah.
Plus, there are people involved. There are real people competing.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You've got to be honest. So yes, that is me being honest every time. There's no benefit in lying.
Have you ever had a dish on MasterChef where it was actually you really, really didn't like, but you had to be polite?
No. I've never been fake about a dish. I might have been less acerbic than people would expect. I mean, sometimes there's a particular thing we do now, and this has changed. The whole thing changes over the years. So a few years ago, they started inviting the critics in to the kitchen to set a challenge. Make me a pie, make me something involving duck breast, whatever. And then the 5 or 6 will cook off, and then they'll present the dish to you. Now, you've got that cook in front of you, and while we all sit at home enjoying MasterChef as great entertainment, and it is great entertainment, these people care. And they've come a long way, and they're very excited, and it ill behoves you to be unpleasant or rude just to get a laugh. Plus, there have been situations I've found when you say very nice things, sometimes they cry. God knows what they'll do if you say some nasty things. I don't want to make people cry. I have done, and I didn't intend to. But you just have to, because they're very, very tense and very, very intense. So you have to be careful with people's emotions. And I'm vain enough to care what people think of me.
Yeah.
And I don't want them looking at me and thinking, he's horrible.
Yeah.
So you can be critical without being horrible.
Yeah.
As I like to tell William Sitwell.
Yeah. So, with your reviews you do, which are so amazing.
Oh,
and
thank you, Mary.
One of my favourite ones you did, where you mentioned your mum.
Well, the recent one at the Alderborough, the Suffolk in Alderborough.
Yeah, where you had, I think, was it a lobster roll?
Lobster and chips.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the way that emerged into the review was, it was honest. I was there with a friend. I'd known about the restaurant for a while because it was opened by somebody I knew quite well. And I sat down, handed the menu, and there on the menu was lobster and chips. And the immediate memory that came to me was this dinner I had with my late mother at the Ivy, just up the road, when it was still good, because it's not anymore. It was a few days before Claire was going to have an operation because she'd been diagnosed with what she called a touch of breast cancer and had opted for a radical double mastectomy as an approach to deal with it, which he actually did. But this was kind of emotional for the whole family, and she wanted to have dinner with me and my wife, and she wanted it to be celebration of life. And there we're sitting at the Ivy, she and I, looking at the menu. We always saw eye to eye over food things. And there was lobster and chips, and we both looked at each other and went, yeah, let's do that. And what's great about that dish is lobster is seen as a luxury thing because it's expensive, and it should be. Never buy a cheap lobster. And yet it's with chips, which are kind of a bit tarty and, less fancy. And so they lend each other a bit of their class. the lobster is made a little less classy by the chips are made a bit classier by the lobster. And so I'm sitting there at the Suffolk looking at this, having this memory and thinking, well, I should tell the story I've just told you. And it's, on the one hand, as a writer, it's a very, I don't want to say easy, but it's a very simple way to grab the reader. It's a very emotional story. You need to learn how to tell those stories without hitting the violins. Don't over-sentimentalize. Just tell it, because the emotion is there. You don't need to tell, just show, just by explaining what's going on. But also, it's a nice story. And I think it got you into the sense of what it was to be in that dining room. So it was, what I think the point I'm making is that none of it's accidental. Whenever I'm planning a review, what I'm going to say, it's thought through. Why am I doing this? What's my opening line? What's my opener? What's going to keep you reading? Why am I doing that? And how am I going to get you to the end so that you finish reading? The one I wrote today, I literally managed to start and finish with the same idea.
Yeah.
And it's ridiculous, but after 24 years of doing it, when I put the full stop, put the word, put the full stop, I looked at it and went, yeah. Which is ridiculous, but in a way, I think explains why I'm still doing it after 24 years.
Yeah. But the one where you mentioned your mum, when you got into the restaurant and you saw the menu, and you saw lobster and chips, did you instantly think of your mum?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I instantly thought of that particular moment.
Yeah.
That said, and she would understand because she was a writer too, there is, how do I put this? Writers are brutal. We take our own personal histories and the histories of those who are around us and treat them as fodder. Everything is up for grabs. There's a great American novelist, Philip Roth, the late Philip Roth, who once said that when a writer is born into the family is dead. And what he meant by that was everything you do, everything you've ever done will be treated as material. Now, I'm not as bad as that. There are certain things in my life which have never, ever found their way onto the page. But everything else, at some point, because you need reference points. You need something that's going to draw people in. And so, sometimes it's all there to be taken.
Yeah. And with the reviews you do, is there a certain dish that you still remember?
There are loads of them.
Yeah.
I am in the process of writing my first cookbook, which will come out to mark my 25 years as a restaurant critic, which is September a year, so 2024. And the premise of the book is me reverse engineering, which is something I've always done, reverse engineering or coming up with home versions of my favourite dishes from those restaurants over the past 25 years, with the involvement, the agreement, sometimes the connivance and support of the chefs involved.
So do you feel they felt comfortable because it's you?
I think there is a benefit to being very, very clear in the long run. In the short run, you know, it's very easy when someone says, here, have a freebie, here, maybe we could, you know, look after you in a particular way. I don't take comps. You cannot book me a table in your restaurant. You cannot invite me to your restaurant. I will either come or I won't. And I know there are some in the business who think it's a bit pious, but I think in the long term, that sort of stuff is very, very important. It should be said, there are a whole bunch of chefs and restaurateurs who absolutely hate me. And that's entirely their prerogative. You know, there's no particular reason why someone should love a restaurant critic.
Yeah. Would you say with your career, you're in a very privileged position?
God, yeah. My whole life's privileged, isn't it? Privilege is something, it's a word, isn't it? Check your privilege. And I remember the first time someone said that, I said, I've checked my privilege, I got loads. Isn't it great? You have to be aware of where you come from and what you are. And I always feel it's important to be clear about it, but also to argue your own case. There was a phrase recently, Nepo babies. Did you see this? Yeah, right. So I got dragged into that. because my mother was a journalist, there's this kind of assumption, well, of course you're a journalist. And I always thought to myself, how did that work? My mother was a sex advice columnist. Why did having a mother who was an expert on premature ejaculation get me a job on MasterChef? It doesn't. But here's what it did do. I grew up, my mother and father came from very humble working class backgrounds. They did very nicely for themselves, made a bit of money, put me through an expensive education. I had a very comfortable upbringing, all of that stuff. I was very, very fortunate. But the main thing that it gave me was I got the opportunity to see a lot of careers that to other people might seem unobtainable. So my mother Claire was a journalist, not just a journalist, but a columnist. She wrote novels. She was a broadcaster. So you got all of those. My old dad, Des, was an actor, and he was a painter, and he was her agent as well. But if you look at all those careers, art, acting, writing fiction, being a journalist, being on TV, being on radio, a lot of people think those are unobtainable careers. In my life, that's what Mum and Dad did. So I didn't for a moment think they were unobtainable, they were obtainable. And so I recognise that is a huge privilege, as is, you know, the comfortable upbringing. The job, it's funny, I had an exchange with a friend of mine who also came from a very comfortable upbringing and became a very successful novelist. And I was saying to her, you and I had the best start in life, but we didn't squander it. And I kind of hold to that. But I don't think that quite answers the question you're asking, which is, am I now in a privileged position? Yes. And I have to be very conscious of it. I've been a restaurant critic for 24 years. I have status. I'm recognised, which means you walk down the street, it's a bit odd. People may want, you know, a selfie. There are worse things in the world. Not always patient. Sometimes I just want to be left alone. I think the pandemic did impact the way I approached what I do. As far as I was concerned pre-COVID, I think everything was open house, open gate. It was open season rather. If you found a restaurant was not very good, you'd say so. Coming out of that time of the restaurants being closed, I said I wasn't going to do negative reviews because I didn't think anybody, it wasn't right with everybody struggling. But also there's a journalist thing, which is read the room. What does the readership want? And I didn't think they wanted to read negative reviews. However, eventually something came along, which was the rooftop at the Dorchester Hotel, where they were charging absurd amounts of money for stupid food. And now my position is, punch up, don't punch down. If you're going to give a bad review, make sure that the recipient both deserves it, but is also going to be able to cope with it. The Dorchester Hotel can cope with a negative review. An expensive bistro in Berkeley Square can cope with a negative review. If I go to a small mom and pop place, which is not very good, not dying, leave it. Pay the bill and move on. This doesn't make me a saint, Mira. I think this is the minimum you can do, really.
Yeah. So there's a real sense of responsibility.
Well, there is a bit. I mean, you know, my reviews in the Observer, probably the print edition will get read hundreds of thousands of times. Online, my most read review ever was 3 million. But hundreds of thousands is a regular amount, and that's a lot.
Yeah.
And even though I know the vast majority of people do not actually go to the restaurants I review, 98% of people read the reviews for vicarious pleasure or displeasure, it can still have a significant impact. And on occasion, when I've had a lovely time, well, two things have changed. I used not to say anything as I left. I thought, just give them time and I'll work out what I think. Now, if I've had a lovely time, I will tell that restaurant I've had a lovely time. Yeah. There's no reason why they should sweat it for 2 or 3 weeks, wait to see what I'm going to say. On occasion, I've said to them, I've had a lovely time, I'm going to write a really positive review and you have to be ready. Because even though maybe only 500 or 1,000 people will try and book tables, that's a tiny amount compared to the number who will read the review. Might be just 1%. that's going to have an impact. And if you can't service that number of people, what was a good restaurant may become a bad one, and I've had that situation.
Yeah.
So there are responsibilities.
And has anyone said, "Oh, it's your fault"?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, people write to me and say, it was great once and you've ruined it. I don't know, what can I do here? I mean, you know, on balance, I think most restaurant businesses would like to be reviewed more than they would like not to be reviewed. There are a couple of usually quite obscure Chinese restaurants say, no, we don't want you.
Yeah.
Still done it. Because their responses have been a bit odd.
Yeah.
Or it's like, you know, this is just for Chinese people. And I'm afraid that smacks of racism. No, everybody's coming to your restaurant if you're opening the door. I'm not playing that game. There was one, Motorway Services, Welcome Break. They wrote to me about their new food offering.
Yeah.
So I went, and it wasn't available. And it was all a bit weird.
Yeah.
And then we said, can we send a photographer? And they said no. And that one ended up on the news pages because you don't get away with that either. So we find a way.
Yeah. Like your career is absolutely, you know, fantastic. People
Yeah, it's all right, isn't it?
people like dream to have your career. But would you say with success, there is a negative side always?
It depends. Well, first thing is, I think a lot of people misunderstand what my job is. A lot of people say, oh, I'd love your job eating all that food. And I have to tell them that's not my job. My job is to write about it. It's a writing job, it's not an eating job. The point I always make is that when I go in a restaurant, all the other people in there are doing the eating as well. I'm the only one who has to go home and write about it. Are there negatives? I think it's about how you deal with it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to complain. I mean, you're inviting me to sort of do a bit of poor me. And there are moments with being recognisable that are a bit annoying. But frankly, if I really didn't like it, I could get off the telly. I could tell MasterChef I didn't want to do it anymore and never take another TV gig. Nobody's making me. Nobody's making anybody who goes on television do it. There are people who are made famous unfairly. They get embroiled in a news story, or they are collateral damage in the story of someone who's much more famous. That's a different matter. But anybody who's on TV a lot, I'm not even on TV a lot, but who's on TV and is recognisable as a result, that is a choice. Do not whine about it. If you do want to whine about it, get off. Do something else.
Yeah. In your career, what would you say so far has been your peak where you thought, God, I absolutely love this?
I have a sideline, which is I'm a jazz pianist. I lead a jazz sextet. I'm very serious about it. I practice a lot. I was practicing this afternoon. I work with terrific musicians. And we gig quite a lot now, 2-3 times a month. And I mean, it's not really the newspaper side. There are a point where I think, God, this is fun, is when I'm sitting on stage, there's a big audience, we're playing and they're loving it. And that is just joyous. And I'm under no illusion that a lot of those people will book the tickets because I'm that bloke off MasterChef, or they heard me on the kitchen cabinet, or they read my reviews. No illusion at all. But once they get there, I want them to be knocked off their feet by what we do. And that is joyous in every single way.
So, would you say you always love music as well?
I was a frustrated musician for a very long time because I found it very hard to get to grips with it. It crept up on me. It took me by surprise. It's a long. Becoming a musician is, I hate the word journey. We're all on a journey, but there was a bit of a journey, and eventually the opportunities came my way. I started gigging long before I had any right to do it, frankly. But eventually you get somewhere, and I feel like, yeah, I've got somewhere now. And it's a very lovely thing to do. I just make sure that the audience is fully entertained, which actually is not too dissimilar from writing the reviews.
Yeah.
That thing is similar. I don't want any audience bored, whether they're reading me or watching me.
I just feel like not everyone would have that confidence that you have, that you can just trip in to different areas.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Is it confidence or is it arrogance? Is it
Where does it come from?
shamelessness? I'm a youngest child, and the youngest is the one that's always kind of, yeah, just go and play in the traffic. You know, the first one is cosseted, the second one, oh my God, and then the third one, yeah, off you go. And so I've never really had a sense that I shouldn't do things. There are a few things I haven't done. There are a few things I haven't been as successful at as I'd like to be. My novels have never really taken off, and I haven't published another one for about 15 years. But what's the worst that can happen, Mira? What's the worst? The one thing I will say is that anything I do, I commit to. So I take it seriously, and I put as much time and effort into it as I possibly can.
Yeah. And to anyone wanting to be a restaurant critic.
Right, yeah. What's my advice?
Yes.
All right. So I get emailed with that question probably 10 times a month, if not more. And they're usually phrased along the lines of, I like food, I'd like your job. And I got so many of them that I wrote a form letter. It's now attached. Please see the attached letter. The letter says, my job is not an eating job, it's a writing job. And if you want to write about restaurants, food, or in fact anything, you have to learn to write. It's a muscle, it's a skill. It's not something anybody can do. You know, the old joke where everybody's got a book in them. Yeah, but 98% of them are rubbish. You need to work at it. So my advice to anybody who wants to write about anything, be it restaurants or food or athletics or jazz, is write about anything and everything. Take every opportunity you possibly can. Maybe even train. I mean, in a way I did train because I spent a year as the editor of a student paper, took it very seriously. That stuff is important. And the other point I have to make is there are only 6 or 7 paying jobs as restaurant critics in the country, maybe a few more. There's not very many.
No.
And there's no career structure. There's more career structure to become Prime Minister.
Yeah.
I can take the route to Prime Minister. I can't take the route to being a restaurant critic. So if that really is your ambition, well, you might want to manage your own expectations. I had no ambition to be a restaurant critic, and I don't really think any of my colleagues did either. We happened upon it. I know that's bloody annoying. I'm really sorry, but it's the truth.
Yeah, it's not an easy road.
No. And it's not fair.
Yeah, exactly. And just getting back to the pandemic. Yes. Do you think your career changed a lot after the pandemic?
Honestly, no. The one benefit I discovered going into the pandemic. So one of the issues was I was a restaurant critic. Although the restaurant reviewing is not the only part of my life, it was very solid. It underpins everything. And all the restaurants closed. The advantage I had was that I had been doing the job for so long that I had a head full of stuff. For various reasons, I worked out what was going to happen about 3 or 4 weeks before it did. And I called one of my editors and said, the restaurant's going to close. So I think I should swap to writing thematic columns about different aspects of our love of restaurants while they're closed. And I came up with a list of about 10 columns. And then I worked my way through them. I was bang on, and that's what we did. So that was the benefit of when the pandemic hit, of being so experienced in the job. Second time they really closed, I came up with another route, which was I wrote a series of 12 pieces about the great cookbooks that have shaped and changed us, and that worked very nicely too. But in a way, that's a job of journalism. of looking around and what's the angle? What am I going to do? Post-pandemic, now my life's pretty similar to what it was. MasterChef, the kitchen cabinet, gigging with the jazz sextet, writing books. It's it's an interesting life.
Yeah. I'd say because I was invited to a charity dinner for a charity called Hospitality UK.
Yeah.
Hospitality Action UK. And when they talked about the pandemic, I was thinking, I've never thought about the hospitality workers, that what they really went through.
Oh, it's horrendous.
Yeah.
I mean, there were lots of reasons why it was horrendous. One is that the financial system for restaurant employees is not useful because this idea, and it drives me nuts, that we tip. There are very few jobs in which we expect people to get by on tips.
Yeah.
When my accountant does my accounts, I don't thank him and give him an extra 20 for doing a nice job. You don't, if your piano teacher, I've had piano teachers, does it great, you don't give them a bit on top.
Yeah.
And yet, there's this category, taxi drivers, maybe hairdressers, restaurant staff. Now, the reason I raise this is because when the furlough scheme kicked in, and it was a certain percentage of salary, the tips were not counted. And so the 80% was being calculated on the absolute bare minimum, and they were in serious trouble. And then, the problem is restaurants are conveyor belts. They're not massively capitalized businesses. It's money in, money out. What they get from the customers goes to pay all the suppliers, and goes out, and maybe there's a bit left over. And the pandemic was absolutely disastrous for them in every single way. And it's still causing damage to this day.
Yeah.
People complain about the costs in restaurants, but we all know about the cost of living crisis and the damage that it's doing to our home lives. So it's not really surprising, is it? It's been dreadful, and it continues to be. And yet, we like being in rooms. We like being in restaurants.
Yeah.
We're talking today in the Stafford Hotel in London, which has a lovely restaurant and a lovely bar, and there is something beautiful about being surrounded by the babble of people once more. We lived through the pandemic, and the main thing is we were ripped away from the company of other people, and that's really what restaurants are about.
Yeah. Absolutely. Because we love the glamour of beautiful restaurants, but we forget the people and their lives.
I think one of the most important things that was said to me during the pandemic was somebody who said, you got to understand, we're not in the business of selling steaks and bottles of wine. We're in the business of selling atmosphere. And that really, really stayed with me. He was absolutely right. We're selling buzz, we're selling atmosphere. We are selling a room that you want to be in. And that's, obviously food is important, but we can get dishes and cooking in many different ways.
Yeah.
But the joy of being in a room with great people, that's what it's about.
Yeah. And my last question
Go
to
on.
you is, what do you prefer? Do you like a classic restaurant, or do you not mind this like modern?
Look, I could not do the job I do if I was very, very picky. I am open to literally everything, of whatever form. I enjoyed the whole modernist thing, the fat duck stuff, hugely. I've done my share of tasting menus of people pushing at the end of gastronomic ambition. But if I'm on my own dime, and I often am, it's probably going to take me back to a tried and tested bistro somewhere doing a bunch of dishes I recognise. And I'm a little embarrassed about that, but it's the truth.
Yeah.
It may be that it's the truth because in my working life I get to try everything else. So that's a privilege. And when it comes to, just wanting to be me, I'm going to go for something unchallenging but very nice. We all like nice things.
Yeah. And what would you say is your favourite Comfort food.
Oh, I suppose, I know this might sound ridiculous, cheese on toast. I love cheese on toast. I also see it as a platform that you can add many things to. I once caused a national storm on BBC Radio when I said, and I like to put bacon on cheese and toast.
Yeah.
They went, what are you talking about? The nation was outraged. But yeah, that's what I like to do.
Yeah.
So if I'm at home, it's a working day, and I'm not too worried about hitting the carbs.
Yeah.
I'm a sizable man. I have to worry about these things. Cheese on toast.
Yeah. That's a good choice.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. And it's been such a pleasure to talk
Well,
to you.
thank you for asking me. It's a privilege to be asked.
Thank you so much.